This is Jay with GTCC doing the vehicle inspection as you'll have you do in the CDL manual. First, walking up to the truck, I'm looking at my clearance, reflectors, identification lights up at the top. They're amber in color, making sure I'm not missing any of my nuts or bolts out of the lenses. These are one function lights. Also, you want to make sure none of the lenses are missing. As I work my way down, I'm looking at my hood mirrors, making sure each hood mirror is not cracked or damaged. None of the mounting brackets are missing. None of the nuts out of the brackets are missing at all. Want to make sure the mirror itself is not cracked or damaged. Then I'm going to work my way down to my headlights, reflectors, and other multifunctional lights. As far as the headlights, I got the high and low beam. I have reflectors here. I have four ways, turn signals, and running lights. Clear in color. My lenses are not cracked or damaged. Not seeing any damage in the inside. None of my reflectors are missing. None of my bulbs are missing. As far as the lenses being held on, I want to make sure I'm not missing any clamps or bolts out of there where the lenses will fall. I will do the same thing over here as I did on this one right here. Same thing with the mirror. Alright, so I'm looking at my overall hood, making sure there's no damage to the hood of my truck. I'm not seeing any cracks or damages. Working my way down to the grill, making sure my grill is not cracked or damaged and not missing any of the nuts and bolts out of my grill. Checking my bumper, making sure my bumper is not cracked or damaged. I'm not missing up the nuts and bolts out of the bumper, holding it on to the frame. Also, I want to make sure my tag is current and up to date and it's held on by a nut and bolt. Looking underneath and making sure I'm not seeing any fluids, no leaks underneath, no hanging belts at all. So from there, I'm going to open the hood up. I'm going to start with the passenger side of the engine. Okay, I'm looking at my overall hoses on the engine, making sure none of my hoses have any abrasions, there's no cuts, I'm not seeing any bulges. I'm looking at all the connections on the hoses that I can see to make sure on some of them I'm not missing any clamps. None of the bolts are missing out of those. I have a good connection all the way to the end on my hoses. So I'm checking all the ones that I can see. Checking my bushings. Making sure my bushings are not missing any of the clamps holding it on to the intake here. Alright. Then I'm going to come down to my belt-driven alternator. On this alternator, I'll make sure the alternator itself is not cracked or damaged. I'm going to make sure the belt is not cut or frayed and have no more than 3/4 deflection in that belt. I'm going to look at the cables leading from my alternator, making sure they are bolted on tight and they're not loose. Also, I'm making sure there are no exposed wires or abrasions coming from these cables. Okay, so I'm gonna double check, look over to make sure I didn't miss anything. Then I'm gonna carry over to the driver's side. On the driver's side, I usually start from the top and work my way out and down. So again, on the top, I'm looking at my overall wiring, making sure I'm not seeing any exposed wires. These are mounted with clamps, and making sure none of these clamps are missing from those. I'm gonna check my coolant reservoir. On the coolant reservoir, I'm gonna make sure that I can see the level of my coolant, which is in between max and full. Max and minimum. Also, making sure that the cap is on tight, hand tighten. Only way I can fill it up if it's cool enough for me to fill by taking the cap off. Also, I want to make sure there's a good seal on that cap to make sure that fluid will not leak out. Working my way down from the hoses leading from the coolant reservoir, making sure my hoses, there's no cut, abrasions, or bulges in that, and it's fitted on tightly with this one with 2 clamps at the top and the bottom of it. Alright, so I'm gonna check my oil dipstick. The way I check this oil dipstick, I'll pull it out, wipe it off, stick it back in and pull it out and see the level of the dipstick, level of my oil. If I need to add oil, I'll go to my oil filler tube and add oil to my inside my oil filler tube, which I'm making sure the filler tube is not cracked or damaged, and I'm making sure there's no nuts and bolts missing from there. Also, I'll make sure the cap is on tight and has a good seal on there. Then I'm checking my water pump. This particular water pump is belt driven. I'm making sure that the belt no more than 3/4 deflection on that. There's no cut or frays on this belt. Then I'm looking back at the water pump itself, make sure I'm not seeing any crack or damages on this belt. There's no leakage coming from it. I'm making sure none of my nuts and bolts are missing from this water pump. Checking it all the way down to the hoses, making sure there's no clamps missing from them hoses, or that there's no cuts, abrasions, or bulges on this hose that will cause any type of leakage. Now I'm back behind the firewall. Here is my gear-driven air compressor. Making sure that this air compressor is not damaged at all. I'm not seeing any crack or damages to it. If I didn't say it's gear-driven. Also making sure none of the bolts are missing from it, mounting it onto the engine. Also looking at the air lines leading from the air compressor, making sure I'm not seeing any abrasion, coats, or bulges in those. Checking the air lines on my firewall here, making sure that I'm not seeing any holes, no abrasions, no cuts in those. Making sure that they're zip tied on, none of them are hanging. Also checking it all the way to the connections to make sure I have good connections at the top and all the way behind the firewall. Okay, now I'm gonna check my steering rod here, making sure the steering rod is not bent or cracked, not seeing any damages to it. Checking it all the way inside the universal joints or knuckles here, making sure it's properly greased. I'm not missing any of the nuts and bolts out of that. Checking it down to my steering gearbox. On the steering gearbox itself is mounted to the frame. I'm checking to make sure the nuts and bolts are there. Not seeing any of that loose. The steering gearbox itself is not cracked or damaged. There's no leaks coming from it. Checking it all the way to my hoses leading from the steering gearbox. No abrasions, no cuts, no bulges in this hose. Checking it to make sure the clamps are in place. I'm not seeing any leakage from there. All the way to the power steering reservoir here, making sure that the cap is on tight. Making sure I got a good seal on there on both my cap. If I need to fill it, I'll take the cap off and get it up to the max level. Also, I'll make sure that I'm not missing any of the nuts and bolts out of here, and this is not cracked or damaged itself. Now I'm checking my pitman arm. On this pitman arm itself, I'm checking the nuts and bolts here at the top, that this is not missing and not loose. Pitman arm itself is not cracked or damaged. Checking it all the way down to my drag link. On the drag link, it's not excessively bent. This is not cracked or damaged. Making sure that the bolt and capsule nut and Carter key is in place. Checking it all the way to the end, where it's connected to my upper control arm. And on that upper control arm, making sure that control arm is not cracked or damaged and it's not bent. Also, I have the bolt and capsule nut and Carter key is in place. All right, looking at my tie rod. Tie rod's right here that goes across, making sure that tie rod's not missing any nuts and bolts out of there. Checking the full length of it. I'm gonna make sure it is not bent and it's not cracked or damaged. All right. Checking my shock absorber. Shock absorber, making sure this shock absorber itself is not cracked or damaged. Not missing any nuts and bolts from the top or the bottom, holding it on. Checking the mounting bracket here to make sure it's not missing any nuts and bolts and that's not cracked or damaged. And the shock absorber itself is not leaking. All right, I'm gonna check my leaf spring hanger at the front and also at the rear. Making sure that that leaf spring hanger is not missing any of the nuts and bolts. Also, the leaf springs itself, I'm not seeing if my leaf springs have scissored. There's none missing or there's any broken. Also, I'm checking to make sure that the U-bolts are in place and they're properly tightened, making sure none of the nuts are missing underneath. Okay, checking my frame, my whole frame from the front of the truck all the way to the rear, making sure this frame, I'm not seeing any stress fractures, no illegal welds. I'm not seeing any cracks or damages to my frame. Okay, now I'm gonna work my way to my brake chamber. First, I'm gonna check the ABS lines and my brake lines. My brake hoses leading all the way to my brake chamber. I'm not seeing any abrasions, no cuts, no bulges in this brake line whatsoever. The connections are tightened and there's no leakage coming from there. Checking the brake chamber itself, I want to make sure this clamp is in place, it's properly tightened, not missing the nuts and bolts out of there. The brake chamber itself is not cracked or damaged. These are disc brakes here, so I'm going to check the brake assembly itself. Have castle nuts and cotter keys in place, so I'll make sure none of those are loose or missing at the top or the bottom and on the other side here. If I can see my brake lining itself, I'm going to make sure that my brake lining has enough friction material that is not rubbing metal to metal. Now, in the inner wheel here, also I'm looking for oil or grease that could cause slippage on my brakes, and making sure I'm not seeing any of that on my wheel. On the wheel itself, I'm not seeing any illegal welds on this wheel. I'm not seeing any type of damage or cracks to it, or no type of stress fractures to that wheel. Also, I want to make sure I'm not seeing any seal breakage coming from my tire to that wheel on this inside of the wheel here. So I'm going to come out and check the outer part of this wheel. Same thing, I'm looking for no type of tire to wheel unsealed from there. Also, I'm checking to make sure the wheel itself is no illegal welds on there, no type of stress fractures on this wheel. I'm checking to make sure it's mounted on correctly by looking at my lug nuts to make sure I'm not seeing any loose lug nuts. There's no rust trail or shiny treads. The only way I could tighten these lug nuts up if one was loose is with torque wrench. Alright, checking my outer hub. On my outer hub seal here, if I had a sight glass, I could look at the sight glass to see it's at the proper level. But if not, I can take the cap off and make sure that it has actually oil in it. Making sure I'm not missing any nuts and bolts all out of there. I'm not seeing any leakage. Okay, checking the outer walls of my tire. Checking both sides, making sure I'm not seeing no abrasions, no cuts, and no bulges on the outer wall of my tire. Checking the tread depth on my tire, making sure it's no less than 4/32. It's not unevenly worn here. This cannot be a recap tire. Okay, now I'm gonna check the tire pressure by using the truck tire pressure gauge. Making sure that through this valve stem, I want to make sure that the valve stem has the DOT cap on there. My valve stem is not cracked or damaged. Alright, so now we're going to get to this side marker light reflector, multifunctional. You got your 4-ways, left turn signal, and your running light. Amber in color, making sure this lens is not cracked or damaged. Not missing any of the bolts missing out of there. Okay, I'm gonna get my door mirror here. I'm not missing any of the bolts missing from the door mirror, holding it on to the door, making sure it's not loose at all. Checking the mirror itself and not seeing any crack or damages to the mirror. Checking my steps, making sure the bolts are in place, none of my steps are loose. Plus, I'm not seeing any oil or debris on my steps. I'm going to check the door itself to make sure it opens and closes properly. And I'm going to make sure that I'm checking the weather stripping around my door to make sure that's in place. Then I'm going to check the hinges on my door to make sure I'm not missing any nuts and bolts, not seeing any crack or damages, none of these are loose. I'm going to check my latching mechanisms here to make sure that the latches are in place and not missing any bolts off of there. Checking on both sides, make sure I'm not seeing any damage, no missing bolts. Also, I'm going to check the weather stripping around my frame, making sure that it's not missing. Okay? Now I'm going to go ahead and check my emergency equipment. ABC fire extinguisher should be fully charged. Also, I want to make sure it's secured in place. The clamp is not missing and it's not loose. Also, I'm checking make sure I have 3 reflective triangles for my truck. Make sure that's in place. And if I'm equipped with fuses in the truck, I want to make sure that I have fuses spare fuses for my truck. So on this door here, my side box, I'm making sure that I'm not missing weather stripping the seal around the door. Also, I want to make sure that my latch is in place, it's not cracked or damaged, and it actually keeps the door shut. Alright, now I'm going to go back to my fuel tank. And on the fuel tank itself, I'm going to look to make sure that I'm not seeing any leakage coming from that fuel tank. I'm going to check the cap. Make sure the cap is on tight. Of course, I would take the cap off to make sure that I have a rubber seal on there to keep fuel from leaking out once it's on. Also, I would check to make sure that the chain is in place. All right. Check my straps. These are metal straps. I want to make sure I'm not missing any nuts and bolts coming from that strap. The strap is not loose. Also, I'll make sure that the rubber is underneath that strap to where it's not rubbing metal to metal. That will cause damages to my fuel tank. Alright, I'm checking the full length of that fuel tank. Also, all the way to the back here. I'm not seeing any damage. So now we're to the back of the cab of the truck. And on the back of the cab itself, first of all, I'm going to look forward to make sure my DOT reflective tape or reflectors are on the back of the cab of this truck and they're not missing. Also, I'm looking for missing rivets. I'm not seeing any missing rivets on the back of this cab. I'm looking all throughout. I'm not seeing any holes or dents or damages to the back of the cab. Any holes could cause an exhaust leak inside, which would be dangerous for the driver. Okay. Now I'm going to check the air lines leading from my tractor. On the air lines itself, making sure that I got a good connection. Also, I'm checking the air line, the full length all the way to the trailer to make sure I'm not seeing any abrasions, no cuts, or no bulges on that air line. I'm going to check it all the way to the glide hands, making sure the glide hands are in the locked position. I got the rubber garments in between to make sure that there be no air leakage coming out. Now I'm going to check my electrical lines. On the electrical lines itself, I'm making sure that the electrical lines, I'm not seeing any exposed, I'm checking the full length, I'm not seeing any exposed wires whatsoever. I'm going to make sure that safety latch is down, holding the electrical lines into the cab of the truck, checking it all the way to the end, making sure that safety latch is down, holding the electrical lines inside for the trailer. Alright, now I'm going to check my steps and catwalk. Making sure with these mounting brackets I'm not missing nuts and bolts. Holding it on to the frame. Making sure the steps itself is not missing nuts and bolts. I'm not seeing any oil or debris on my steps or my catwalk. On this catwalk I'm not missing any of the rivets or nuts and bolts. The clamps are tight, holding this catwalk securely to the frame. Also, I'm going to look at my drive shaft. On my drive shaft itself, I'm making sure that drive shaft is not bent or damaged, checking it all to the full length. I'm checking to make sure that inside the universal joints I'm not seeing no debris, it's properly greased. Also underneath here, I'm checking my exhaust. On the exhaust itself, I'm making sure I'm not missing any of the clamps, or none of the bolts are missing or nuts holding this exhaust in place. The exhaust is not cracked or damaged. And there's, I'm not seeing a soot trail coming from the side of this exhaust. Alright, so I'm going to get the header board of my trailer, making sure that I'm not seeing any missing rivets. Also, there are no cuts or damages or holes in the header board of my trailer. Checking my clearance and marker lights up at the top, amber in color, making sure none of the nuts and bolts are missing out of the housing. Alright, so now I'm checking the side of my trailer. Checking it the full length of the trailer, making sure I'm not missing any rivets making sure I'm not seeing any holes or damages to my trailer. Checking the frame rail, checking the full length, I'm not missing. There's no rivets missing, there's no nuts and bolts missing. I'm not seeing any stress fractures to my frame. Also, I want to make sure there's DOT reflective tape the full length of my trailer. Okay. So now I'm gonna get back to the suspension of the drive axles here, back here on the truck. I want to make sure that this hanger here, not missing any nuts and bolts, mounting it to the frame, checking it all the way to the torque arm. The torque arm itself, make sure I'm not missing any nuts and bolts from there, and this is not cracked or damaged. All right, I have a brake chamber on the brake chamber itself, not missing any of the clamps on the brake chamber. That brake chamber is not missing, it's not cracked or damaged. Checking my brake lines and hoses, making sure I'm not seeing no abrasions, no cuts, no bulges. And here at the end, I have a good connection. So these back here also, I'm looking at disc brakes. So on the disc brakes itself, I'm checking the housing itself, making sure that the brakes are not missing any castle nut or the cotter keys missing out of those. Also, I'm gonna check my brake lining, make sure the brake lining is not low where it would be rubbing metal to metal. And inside of this wheel, I want to make sure I'm not seeing any oil or grease inside of this wheel coming from any leakage from the axle. All right, so I'm gonna check to make sure that the wheel itself, I'm not seeing any stress fractures, I'm not seeing any illegal welds on this wheel, is not cracked or damaged. All right, so I'm working my way, checking my U-bolts here, making sure the U-bolts are not cracked or damaged, make sure they're tightened, make sure none of the nuts are missing. Checking this shock absorber. Checking the shock absorber mount, it's not cracked or damaged, not missing any bolts. Checking the bolts holding the shock absorber on from top to bottom, making sure the bolts are tightened, no missing nuts. The shock absorber itself is not cracked or damaged, and not seeing any leakage coming from this shock absorber. All right. Yeah. So now I'm gonna finish checking the wheel. I already checked the inside of the wheel. Now I'm gonna check in between at the bud spacing to make sure that there's no debris. It's the proper spacing where these tires are not touching or rubbing each other. Checking it all the way to the outer wheel, making sure my outer wheel got a good seal around the tire. Not seeing any illegal welds on this wheel. This wheel is not cracked or damaged. Checking this axle seal here, making sure I'm not missing any nuts and bolts out of there. I'm not seeing any type of oil or grease leakage coming from there. Checking, make sure all my lug nuts and studs are in place. No missing lug nuts. Making sure there's no loose lug nuts by seeing a rust trail or shiny threads. All right. I'm gonna check the pressure on these tires by looking at my valve stem. I have one here and I have one right here. Making sure both valve stems are not cracked or damaged. I'm not missing the DOT cap off of those. The way I can check my tire pressure is with my truck tire pressure gauge. Alright, so I'm checking both of my tires here. I'm going to check all outer walls of these tires, making sure I'm not seeing no abrasions, no cuts, or no bulges on either of these tires. Checking that tread depth on the tires to make sure the tread depth is no less than 2/32. These cannot be a recap or mix match tires, and they are evenly worn. Alright. So now underneath here, I'm gonna check the apron of this trailer. I'm not seeing any cracks or damages to the apron of my trailer. Also looking across, I want to make sure I'm not seeing any gap in between my trailer and the fifth wheel. Checking to make sure I'm checking the skid plate. I'm not seeing any damage to the skid plate, and it's properly greased. I'm gonna check to make sure my release handle is in the lock position. Okay, and that handle is not damaged. I'm gonna check the pivot pin. Make sure that the pivot pin's in place. It's being held in place by castle nut and a bolt to make sure that pivot pin does not slide out. Also, I'm gonna check the mount, making sure that mount's not cracked or damaged. I'm checking the platform, no damage to my platform, no cracks or damage. This is a sliding fifth wheel, so I want to make sure that the locking pins are in place on this fifth wheel. Also, I'm checking the nuts and bolts holding this fifth wheel, sliding fifth wheel in place to the frame. None of those are loose or missing. Checking the air lines itself, making sure my air lines, not seeing no cuts, no abrasions or no leaks coming from the air lines. Alright, so I'm gonna check this airbag or air bellow, making sure that the airbag mount is in place. I'm not missing any nuts and bolts coming from the mount. Also down to the airbag, I'm not seeing no abrasions, no bulges or no cuts to this airbag. Checking at the bottom mount also to make sure I'm not missing any nuts and bolts, which will be underneath here. I'm not missing nuts and bolts. Alright, so of course I would do this axle the same way I do this axle, making sure everything is straight the same way I did this one. Alright, so I'm going to get my splash guard here. Making sure back here on this splash guard is not missing. Checking the splash guard mount to make sure I'm not missing any nuts and bolts holding this on to the mount. Making sure my DOT reflective tape is in place. Okay, so I'm going to go underneath and finish up with the fifth wheel. Okay, on that fifth wheel itself, I'm making sure that the locking jaws are actually in place and going around the shank of that kingpin. Making sure that the kingpin itself, I'm not seeing any cracks or damages or it's missing whatsoever to that kingpin. Okay, checking the cross members on this trailer. I'm gonna check it the full length of the trailer, front to back, making sure none of the cross members are damaged. I'm not seeing any stress fractures to this cross members. Checking the floor of my trailer, making sure there's no holes in the floor of my trailer. Checking the cross members on my tractor, making sure I'm not missing any nuts and bolts coming from the cross members. Cross members are not cracked or damaged. Checking my reflectors, they're red in color. I'm not missing any nuts and bolts. None of the lenses are cracked or damaged. Checking my multifunctional lights back here in the back, red in color. I got brake lights, four ways, running lights, left turn signal and right turn signal back here, and running lights. Not missing any of the rivets out of the housing on these lights. Checking my reverse light, not missing the rubber seal, keeping it in place. It's clear in color. One function is reverse lights. Alright, so we're going to finish up with the trailer coming out. Alright, so on the trailer itself, I'm going to make sure the landing gear mounts and cross members are not damaged, not missing nuts and bolts, not seeing any stress fractures to the cross members at all. Checking my landing gear itself, the legs, make sure there's no crack or damage. Make sure my legs are fully raised. Checking these landing pads to make sure on the landing pads itself I'm not seeing no debris. And the nut and bolt that's holding the landing pads onto the leg is not missing. I want to make sure that my crank handle is in the stowed position. It's not cracked or damaged, not missing any nuts and bolts off that. Alright, so I'm working my way down, checking my lights and reflectors, making sure they're amber in color. I'm not missing the rubber garment holding in place. It's not missing. Making sure the bracket is not missing. None of the rivets are damaged. Keeping this on. This has multifunctional. You have your left turn signal, your running light, your four ways on this particular light here. So keep walking, keep looking at overall. Make sure I'm not seeing no damage on my trailer. So I'm working my way back here to the trailer. Tandem axles here. So go inside here and checking all the suspension. I'm checking my leaf spring hanger, making sure there's no broken welds on this hanger. I'm not seeing any crack or damages. Checking the leaf springs. Leaf springs itself, not seeing no scissor leaf springs. I'm not seeing any U-bolts missing. None of my leaf springs are cracked or damaged on the U-bolts, making sure the nuts are in place, holding them springs tight. Also, I'm checking this torsion bar here. torsion bar is not cracked or damaged, not bent. Also, there's no nuts and bolts missing from the torsion bar. Checking this brake chamber. On the brake chamber itself, not missing, it's not leaking. I'm not seeing any cracks or damage to this brake chamber, and there's no missing clamps. The nuts and bolts are not missing off this brake chamber. Checking it all the way to the slack adjuster and push rod that's in the rear of this brake chamber. On the slack adjuster and push rod, making sure that the locking pin is in place, the Carter key is in place, holding that rod in place. And with the brakes released, I should not pull this slack adjuster push rod no more than an inch. All right, so now that I'm inside this is brake drums. So on the brake drums itself, I'm not seeing any illegal welds on there. There's no grease. The brake drum itself is not cracked or damaged. Checking my brake pads. I want to make sure the brake pads have enough friction material on there that it's not rubbing metal to metal. Also, I'm not seeing any grease coming from the axle seal on this truck. All right, so also in the inside here of my wheel, I'm not seeing no stress fractures, no cracks or damages to this wheel. Making sure it has a good seal with the tire. All right, so I'm checking my outer walls of my tire, checking all of my tires to make sure the outer walls, I'm not seeing no abrasions, no bulges, or no cuts on these outer walls of all the tires. Okay, checking the tread depth. The tread depth can be no less than 2/32 on the tread depth. These can be recapped, but also cannot be mismatched tires. Also, I'm checking to make sure they're evenly worn. Checking the butt spacing in between, making sure that it's no debris is inside that can fly out. Also, I'm making sure there's no tires rubbing against each other. All right, checking the outer wheel, making sure it has a good seal with the tire. There's no stress fractures on this wheel, no cracks or damage. Checking to make sure all my lug nuts and studs are in place and they're all tight. Not seeing any shiny threads or rust trail. All right, only way I can tighten a loose one is with a torque wrench. Also, I'm gonna check the valve stems, both of them, to make sure I'm not seeing any missing DOT caps off of those. The valve stems are not cracked or damaged. Only way I can check the pressures with the tire pressure gauge. Checking my outer hub seal here, making sure this has a sight glass so I can see the level. Making sure it's at the proper level. Also, I'm making sure none of my nuts and bolts is missing and the cap is in there secured tight. All right. Then I'll do this tire the same way, this axle the same way I did this one. So I'm checking the mud flap in the back, making sure this mud flap's proper level off the ground. I'm not missing any nuts and bolts out of this mud flap. I'm not seeing any damages to my mud flap. Alright, so now at the rear of the trailer, start from the top. Checking the clearance marker lights at the top. Red in color, got the rubber gasket around it that's holding them in place. Also, make sure none of the lenses are missing. Checking my multifunctional lights here at the bottom. I have 4 ways, brake lights, running lights, left and right turn signal. Making sure the red lenses are in place and it's not missing. I got the rubber around there holding these in place. Also, I'm checking the door, making sure my door is not damaged, not seeing any crack or holes in my door. Checking the cables on these doors here to make sure none of the cables are snapped, they're broken, or I'm not seeing any that are frayed. Making sure I got DOT reflective tape on my door. Alright, checking, make sure I got DOT tape on my DOT bumper here. Making sure this bumper's not cracked or damaged, not seeing any stress fractures or broken welds on this bumper. Also, I'm making sure that this safety latch of the door is locked in place and it won't come open. Making sure I'm looking at the strap itself, making sure I'm not missing the strap and the rivets are holding this in place. Also, the handle is not cracked or damaged. So at this point here, is when you would do your end cab and you're gonna start your light check. You'll have the examiner stand outside and you'll go inside and do all your light checks. You do the rear, you're gonna do the light checks on your side of your trailer. So have the examiner know what you're checking. First you're gonna say you're checking your marker lights at the top. I'm gonna give you a thumbs up. Alright, now you wanna check your left and right turn signal. Thumbs up. You're gonna check your brake lights. Thumbs up. Running lights. Thumbs up. Four ways. Keep going. Make sure you're getting all your lights. This trailer's not equipped with an ABS light, so you're gonna check this marker light here. Make sure you get it. Alright? So you're gonna work your way down. Same thing. If you're on the side, you got the running lights, left turn signal. Make sure you're getting the four ways on that light. Alright? Make sure you get the rear of the tractor. Multifunctional lights back here. You got your four ways, left turn signal, right turn signal. You got your running lights back here. You got your brake lights. Alright? You got your marker light up here at the top. Marker light, clearance light. Make sure you get this light. Alright? So you work your way to the front of the trailer. Make sure you're not missing your clearance lights at the top. You want to get credit for it. Okay? Get up the side light right here. You got the left turn signal. You got your four ways. You got your running light on that. So when you start to check the hood light, when you get in the truck anyway, you're gonna shut the hood. So when the examiner comes to this point, you're gonna check indication lights, clearance lights up here at the top to make sure those are running. Then you're gonna work your way down to your headlight. You're gonna hit your regular headlight, your high and low beam, your left and right turn signal, your four ways, and your regular running lights for the sides there too. Then after that, once you finish your light check, the examiner is going to get in the truck and we're going to start the end cab. Okay, with starting of the end cab, you always you're gonna have the key in your hand. But since we stood outside and did everything outside, we want to make sure that when you're doing your light check that you actually have the truck turned on. You got the key right there. So when you was doing your light check, you want to make sure that the key was turned on to the on position. That's the only way some of the lights are going to work. All right. So once the examiner gets in, first thing you need to check is your seat belt. You want to make sure this seat belt is not cut or frayed or damaged and it actually works. So you want to put it in to make sure that it actually stays locked in and that it works. Then you're going to make sure the truck is in neutral and you can do your safe start. So I'm going to do my safe start. Alright, as soon as I start the truck, immediately I'm looking at my oil pressure. I'm making sure my oil pressure rises. Okay? If it didn't rise, I would shut the truck immediately off. Then now I'm going to check the rest of my gauges. My water temperature, I'm gonna wait, making sure that it properly gets to the operating range, 175 to 195 on that. Checking to make sure my air pressure is rising. I'm gonna make sure operating range between 100 and 120 on that operating range on your air pressure. All right, so I'm gonna cycle through and get to my voltmeter on the dash. I'm making sure that I'm checking the voltmeter on my dash. All right, so while I'm still sticking with the dash, I'm gonna check my indicator lights to make sure the left turn signal works, right turn signal works. Checking to make sure the four-way indicator is working. Also, I'm checking to making sure the high and low beam is working, indicator works. All right, so I'm gonna check my mirrors and looking at both mirrors to make sure the mirrors are clean and adjusted for me. All right, I'm gonna check my windshield. Not seeing any damages to my windshield, making sure I got the weather stripping around, a good seal around my windshield. I'm not seeing any illegal stickers. There's no obstruction of view for me looking out my windshield. I'm checking my windshield wipers to make sure they're working. Also, I want to make sure I got the windshield wiper fluid. Alright. Now I'm going to check my city horn, make sure that's working. Also, I'm checking the air horn to make sure that that's working. Checking my steering wheel and make sure there's no excessive play in my steering wheel. Alright, now I'm going to check my heat and defrost. So I'm going to turn the heat. I'm going to check my defrost to make sure that's working. That's good. I'm going to switch it to make sure my heat's working. And that's working. Alright. So double checking. Make sure we got everything. Alright, so now we're going to do the parking brake check. I'm going to check my tractor parking first. So I'm going to push in the trailer. Alright, and I'm going to do a tug on that. Alright, so that's holding. Now I'm going to push that in, pull out the trailer, because I'm going to check the trailer. Same thing. Alright, so that's holding. Alright, now I'm going to check my service brake. By having them both pushed in, I'm going to drive no more than 5 miles an hour to make sure it's not pulling to the left or right. Okay, and that holds. So since this truck is equipped with a hand valve, I'm going to hold this down and tug on this to make sure that that doesn't keeps the trailer in position. Alright, so now before I start the lab, I have to put a chalk out. So I'm going to put my truck back in neutral and I'm going to set my brakes. Alright, so to do a proper lab, you want to make sure that your air pressure stays above 100. It's ideal to have it at 120 to keep to do the proper lab. Anytime you get out of the truck doing testing, you always want to shut the truck off. Alright, and this is so since this is the automatic truck, I have to get out. Alright, so air pressure has built up, so I'm going to go ahead and turn the truck off. Alright, take the key with you, and you get out and you set your chalk. So you climb back in. All right, make sure you put your seat belt back on. You got to remember you're still testing. So seat belt back on. Turn the key to the on position. Let your dash go ahead and cycle through and start looking at your indicators. So what you're looking for is you're looking at your air pressure. So air pressure is above 100. So light pressure on the brake to hold it in place so it won't run. And let the chalk stop the truck. Alright, so the air pressure went below 100. So I'm going to let the examiner know I need to build my air pressure back up. So what I'm going to do is put the truck back on and let the air pressure build up so I'm able to actually do a lab. So I want to get it above 100. Cannot do a proper lab unless it's over 100. Because remember, we said operating range was 100 to 120. So that's why we're letting the air pressure build up. So like I said, I like mine to get close to 120, 140, so I can do a proper lab. Alright, so now my air pressure has built up, so I'm going to shut the truck off and I'm going to turn it back on to the on position. Alright, so there's no need to stand on the brakes. Just put 5 pounds of pressure on it. Make sure you got your window down. Let the examiner know with 5 pounds of pressure, I should lose no more than 4 psi within 60 seconds. Could you time me, please? So once the examiner is timing you, he'll probably say, okay, proceed or carry on. So once that 60 seconds is up, you pause and you let them know what's going to happen at 60 psi. At 60 psi, my lights and alarms should come on. So start the fan down. So you keep fanning until that lights and alarms come on. So lights and alarms have came on. So between 40 and 20, my air valve should pop out. So you continue fanning down till you see both of them pop out. Don't stop until both pop out. So you want to visually look at it. So both of them pop out. Now your lab is complete and the pre-trip is done.